For centuries, the world has looked to Vatican as a beacon of divine light, a holy sanctuary of absolute morality. But behind the towering stone walls of Rome lies a legacy of political survival, shadow diplomacy, and terrifying alliances that history has tried to bury. What if the most powerful religious institution on earth was never neutral, but was instead the silent architect behind the survival of the 20th century's greatest monsters? The disturbing truth is not found in science fiction, but in cold, declassified military records and historical evidence that modern history books refuse to whisper. Long before the dust settled on the ruins of World War II, the Vatican had already secured survival through unholy pacts, beginning with the highly controversial diplomatic treaties that practically legitimized rising totalitarian regimes. When the war ended and the world demanded justice, a covert network of high-ranking clerics utilized the sovereign power of the Church to orchestrate the escape of hundreds of infamous fugitives, turning holy sanctuaries into safe houses and providing the passports that allowed them to slip away into the shadows of South America. If the Church was willing to weaponize its spiritual authority to shield cold-blooded killers, what other secrets are buried in the depths of its private archives? From mysterious, dark ties linking the Vatican Bank to the Italian mafia and secret societies like the Propaganda du Masonic Lodge, to the hidden ledgers of wealth plundered during the global conflict, we are peeling back the veil of sanctity to expose the absolute, disturbing power of the Holy See. To understand the true depth of this historical nightmare, we must look past speculation and confront the cold, documented paper trail left by the architects of the ratlines. The primary mastermind behind this escape network was not a shadow operative, but a highly visible prince of the Church, Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian-born rector of the Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome. Hudal did not hide his allegiances. He was a self-proclaimed sympathizer of the nationalist cause, writing a book that attempted to bridge the gap between Christian theology and racial ideology. In the chaotic aftermath of 1945, as Allied forces scrambled to secure the ruins of Europe and round up war criminals, Hudal saw his holy duty not in bringing monsters to justice, but in saving what he believed to be the defenders of Western civilization against the threat of Eastern communism. He utilized his immense influence within the Pontifical Commission of Assistance to establish a pipeline that operated with terrifying clinical efficiency. The mechanism of this escape route exploited the absolute desperation of post-war humanitarian efforts. The International Committee of the Red Cross, completely overwhelmed by millions of displaced refugees wandering the broken continent, lacked the resources to verify the identities of every individual seeking travel papers. This is where the clerical network struck. Under Hudal's direction, sympathetic priests inside monasteries and convents across Italy provided fleeing SS officers with temporary shelter, food, and crucial letters of recommendation. These Vatican-sanctioned documents certified that these men were stateless, persecuted refugees. Armed with these holy letters of recommendation, the Red Cross, acting in good faith, issued humanitarian passports under false names. Under the cover of these falsified passports, the most notorious mass murderers in human history walked past Allied checkpoints completely undetected. Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucratic architect of the Holocaust who organized the transport of millions to death camps, fled Europe under the alias Riccardo Clement, actively guided through Italy by Franciscan friars who even arranged his housing in Rome. Joseph Mengele, the sadistic doctor known as the Angel of Death for his horrifying medical experiments on twins at Auschwitz, navigated the very same clerical pipeline under the name Helmut Greger, shielded by monastic walls before boarding a ship to South America. Franz Stangl, the ruthless commandant of the Treblinka and Sobibor extermination camps, personally received his travel documents and money from Bishop Hudal himself, later recounting how the bishop shook his hand and wished him well on his journey to Brazil. Walter Roth, the SS officer who designed the mobile gas vans that killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, did not just utilize this network. He actively disguised himself in the heavy black cassock of a Catholic priest, blending seamlessly into the religious processions of Rome to evade Allied investigators who were scouring the city for his arrest. This was not a loose coalition of rogue priests acting out of misguided charity, but a highly organized, institutionalized machinery of survival that turned the most sacred symbols of the Christian faith into a literal shield for the perpetrators of the Holocaust. The psychological impact on Allied intelligence was one of absolute frustration and growing paranoia as they watched high-value targets vanish into thin air, only to realize that the trail led directly back to the sovereign, untouchable sanctuaries of the Holy See, where the local police could not step and where the truth was sealed under the eternal vow of silence. To fully comprehend how the sacred robes of Rome came to shield the perpetrators of the Holocaust, we must trace the bloodline of this conspiracy back to the pivotal moment the seed of this unholy alliance was planted. Long before the ratlines were operational, in the sweltering summer of 1933, the Vatican entered into a covenant that would forever stain its moral authority. Hitler had been in power for only a few brief months, leading a volatile, violent regime that was viewed with intense skepticism and alarm by the international community. The Nazi dictator desperately needed global legitimacy, a stamp of approval that would signal to the world and to the millions of devout German Catholics that his administration was not a gang of dangerous thugs, but respectable sovereign power. He found his savior in Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, the brilliant and calculating Vatican Secretary of State, who would later ascend the papal throne as Pope Pius XII. On July 20th, 1933, Pacelli and Hitler's vice-chancellor, Franz von Papen, signed a highly controversial Reichskonkordat, a diplomatic treaty that established an official alliance between the Holy See and the Third Reich. The psychological trade-off was as cold as it was devastating. In exchange of protection of Catholic schools, properties, and religious privileges within Germany, the Vatican agreed to a clause of absolute political capitulation under the Pope's direct orders. The German Center Party, the oldest and most powerful Catholic political resistance against the rise of fascism, was voluntarily dissolved. With a single stroke of a pen, the Vatican neutralized Hitler's most formidable domestic opposition, effectively clearing the path for the Nazi Party to establish an absolute, unchallengeable dictatorship. The psychological shockwave across Germany was profound. Millions of devout citizens who had been prepared to fight the pagan philosophy of the Nazi regime suddenly watched their spiritual shepherds shake hands with the devil, interpreting the papal signature as a tacit, holy blessing of the Führer's mission. As the years rolled on and the darkness deepened, this initial capitulation transformed into a heavy, suffocating silence. When the Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jewish citizens of their humanity, when the streets of Germany burned during Kristallnacht in 1938, and even when the industrialized slaughter of the death camps was operating at peak capacity, the voice of the Pope remained frozen in calculated neutrality. This deafening silence was not born out of ignorance. Declassified diplomatic dispatches prove that the Vatican's intelligence network knew of the ongoing atrocities in vivid, agonizing detail. Instead, it was a cold, institutional decision driven by an obsessive fear of Bolshevik communism, a desperate need for self-preservation, and a historical anti-Semitism that had simmered in ecclesiastical corridors for centuries. The psychological toll on Allied leaders was one of immense frustration and betrayal, as they realized that the ultimate moral compass of the Western world had quietly chosen to sacrifice millions of innocent lives to secure its own survival and political dominion, setting a terrifying precedent that would soon allow the Church to transition seamlessly from the ruins of Berlin to the dark, profitable shadows of the criminal underworld. To understand how the sacred was weaponized into a multi-billion-dollar shield for organized crime, we must confront the ultimate betrayal of the very foundation of faith. The historical records of the 20th century reveal a chilling paradox that stands in violent opposition to the origins of Christianity. 2,000 years ago, Jesus of Nazareth famously stormed the sacred temple of Jerusalem, physically overturning the tables of the money changers and raging against the false prophets who had turned a house of prayer into a den of thieves. Furthermore, the profound, enlightened theological works of intellectual giants like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, men who dedicated their lives to elevating human reason, charity, and spiritual truth, were systematically hijacked by a powerful institutional hierarchy. The words of these holy philosophers were not used to liberate, but were instead twisted into a clinical tool of psychological dominion and absolute political control. By the arrival of the Cold War, the spiritual empire had fully transitioned into a sovereign, untraceable financial fortress. At the dark heart of this system was the Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for Works of Religion, under the ruthless leadership of American-born Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. The bank ceased to be an instrument of charity and became a high-level laundering machine for the Sicilian mafia and corrupt international politicians. This real-world shadow play, which directly inspired the darkest plot lines of the Godfather films, operated through an unholy alliance with the Propaganda Due, an outlawed, clandestine Masonic lodge led by the sinister Licio Gelli. The P2 Lodge was a secret shadow government, a fascist syndicate that had deeply infiltrated the Italian military, the state, and the highest echelons of the Catholic clergy. Together with Roberto Calvi, the president of Banco Ambrosiano and the man known to the underworld as God's banker, they routed millions of dollars of plundered assets, drug money, and political bribes through Vatican accounts that were legally shielded from police investigation. But when the House of Cards began to collapse in the early 1980s, the consequences were lethal. In June of 1982, Roberto Calvi was found hanging from scaffolding beneath London's Blackfriars Bridge, his pockets stuffed with bricks and thousands of dollars in various currencies, a classic, terrifying signature of a mafia execution disguised as a suicide to silence him forever. Even more disturbing is the sudden, highly suspicious death of Pope John Paul I in 1978. Having occupied the papal throne for only 33 days, the reform-minded pontiff had reportedly ordered a full, sweeping audit of the Vatican Bank's corrupt ledgers, intending to purge the institution of its criminal ties and return the Church to its humble, spiritual roots. His sudden demise in the dead of night, followed by an immediate embalming that prevented an autopsy, remains one of the modern world's most terrifying open secrets. The psychological impact of this era left investigators in a state of absolute dread, as they realized that the very institution claiming to hold the keys to heaven was actively collaborating with the lords of the criminal underworld, using the absolute vow of silence to protect a network of greed, murder, and corruption that stretched from the streets of Palermo to the deepest vaults of Rome. If the leaders of the sacred institution were willing to shake hands with brutal dictators, shield history's most wanted mass murderers, and launder the blood-stained fortunes of the mafia under the guise of holy work, we are forced to confront a terrifying question. What else is lurking in the dark? For centuries, the Vatican's secret archives, stretching across over 50 miles of subterranean shelving, have remained one of the most heavily guarded and impenetrable repositories of human history. While the public is allowed access to carefully curated historical documents, rumor and logical speculation have persisted for generations about Vault 14, a legendary, restricted sector of the archives. Many independent researchers and whistleblowers believe this specific vault holds the ultimate, unredacted ledger of the 20th century, including a definitive list of every fugitive smuggled to the ratlines, the precise locations of plundered gold reserves, and the secret pacts that truly shaped our modern world. This is the ultimate, heartbreaking tragedy of a system that hijacked the profound, liberating philosophies of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, and completely silenced the righteous fury of Jesus of Nazareth, who once used a whip to drive the corrupt money changers out of his temple. The profound spiritual search for human truth was systematically weaponized, transformed into a clinical and highly sophisticated tool of absolute psychological dominion and financial control. If the Holy See has nothing to hide, why does the heavy veil of secrecy remain so absolute, and why are these centuries-old vaults kept far beyond the reach of international investigators? We now stand at a deeply unsettling crossroads of history, and we want to know where you stand. Should the Vatican be legally forced to open every single one of its secret vaults and expose the absolute, raw truth to humanity, even if that devastating reality completely destroys the religious faith of billions and destabilizes the political order of the world? Or is a certain level of engineered ignorance actually necessary to preserve the fragile peace of our civilization? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Because in a world built on historical silence, your voice is the only weapon that can break the lock. If you are ready to dismantle the lies and expose the forces that rule from the shadows, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and join us as we continue to shine a light on what lies hidden in Brazil and across the darkest corners of our map.